At 64, I had seen enough seasons change on my Colorado farm to know when a storm was coming. But I didn't expect the storm to be wearing a tailored suit, drinking my expensive bourbon, and laughing in my hallway. It was my daughter Jenna's engagement party. I spent months preparing the main barn, paying for the caterers, and making sure the evening was perfect. My husband passed away a decade ago, leaving me the 400-acre property. It wasn't just land. It was my life's work. Jenna had always been eager to leave the dirt roads behind, drawn to city lights and quick money. That was where she met Troy. I never liked him. He had a habit of looking at my house not as a home, but as a real estate listing. Still, I kept my mouth shut. I wanted my daughter to be happy. Halfway through the evening, I stepped into the back hallway to check on the extra ice. The heavy service door was cracked open. Troy was standing on the porch, smoking a cigar with his best man, Greg. I stopped walking when I heard my name. Her mother is stubborn. Troy chuckled, the ice clinking in his glass. But she's old. She won't hold on to this place forever. Greg laughed. You're really doing this, man, marrying the farm girl. I mean, she's not exactly your type. Troy blew out a cloud of smoke. The words that followed erased any trace of a mother's warmth in my chest. She's ugly, Troy replied smoothly. But her mother owns land worth millions. After the wedding, I'll control every acre. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my tray. I didn't burst into tears like a fragile widow. I just stood there in the shadows, letting the cold reality settle into my bones. My daughter was marrying a parasite. Through the window, I could see Jenna showing off her ring, oblivious. Troy thought he had already won. He thought I was just a quiet woman who would hand over the keys to her kingdom. He was wrong. The toast was scheduled in 10 minutes. I turned around, walked into my office, and picked up my phone. I needed to make one call before he raised his glass. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't need a legal battle to protect what belonged to me. I simply called David, the manager of the local bank in town. We had known each other for 30 years, and he always answered his cell phone, even on a Saturday night. David, it's Opal, I murmured, staring at the framed map of my property on the wall. I need you to do something for me right now. Opal, is everything okay? He asked, his voice full of typical small-town warmth. The party is fine, but I need you to empty the joint wedding account I set up with Jenna. Transfer every single dollar back into my primary operating account. Tomorrow morning, I want you to cancel the cashier's check I wrote for the wedding venue. There was a brief pause on the line. David didn't ask probing questions. He knew me well enough to understand that I never made rash decisions. Consider it done, Opal. The funds are moving back to your sole account right now. Thank you, David, I replied and hung up. Just like that, the $60,000 I had set aside for their perfect day was gone. I smoothed down my dress and walked back into the main barn. The band had stopped playing, and the event coordinator was handing Troy a microphone. He stood at the front of the room looking like a magazine cover model. Jenna stood beside him, gazing up at him with absolute adoration. The crowd quieted down as Troy raised his glass of champagne. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Troy began, flashing a practiced, brilliant smile. To celebrate not just love, but family. Jenna is my whole world. And I want to give a special thanks to Opal. You've welcomed me with open arms, and your generosity in hosting us on this beautiful property means everything. To the future, the guests cheered, glasses clinked. Jenna wiped a tear from her eye. I walked slowly to the front of the room, my sensible shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. I didn't look angry. I felt completely empty, which made my mind incredibly sharp. I stepped up beside Troy and gently took the microphone from his hand. He blinked clearly, confused by the interruption, but his plastic smile froze in place. I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, neighbors, extended family friends. Then I turned my gaze to Troy. "Thank you for the kind words, Troy." I spoke clearly into the microphone. "But before we drink to the future, I think we should be honest about the present." A few minutes ago, I overheard Troy talking to his friend on the back porch. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. People shifted in their seats. I saw Troy's jaw tighten. He was explaining his real plans for this marriage. I continued, my voice steady and flat. He said, and I quote, "She's ugly, but her mother owns land worth millions. After the wedding, I'll control every acre." A collective gasp rippled through the barn. Jenna's face drained of color. She looked at Troy, her eyes wide with shock. "That's a lie." Troy stammered, his confident posture crumbling. "I never said that, Opal. You must have misheard me." I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. I simply looked at my daughter. "Jenna, he doesn't love you. He wants the farm." I expected Jenna to throw her drink in his face. I expected her to pull off the ring. Instead, she turned her anger on me. "Mom, stop it," she yelled, her voice echoing in the silent barn. "You're ruining my night. You've always hated him because he wants to improve this old place. You're just making this up because you're a bitter old woman who wants to keep me trapped here." I stared at my daughter. The sheer entitlement in her voice was like a physical blow. She was choosing the illusion of this man over the mother who had raised her. She was willing to overlook his cruelty as long as she got her perfect wedding. I didn't cry. I didn't scream back. I simply set the microphone down on the nearest barrel. "The party is over," I announced to the room. "Please drive home safely." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the barn, leaving them to deal with the whispers and stares of the guests. If Jenna wanted to defend a man who called her ugly for a payout, that was her choice. They thought I would retreat to my room and cry. They didn't know me at all. The next morning, I woke up at 5 o'clock just like I did every day. I brewed a pot of coffee, fried 2 eggs, and sat at my kitchen island. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around 8, Jenna and Troy finally came downstairs. They had stayed in the guest bedroom, acting as if nothing monumental had happened the night before. Troy looked annoyed, rubbing his temples, while Jenna refused to make eye contact with me. Troy marched straight to the coffee maker, poured himself a mug, and leaned against my counter. He looked at me with a mixture of arrogance and impatience. "Look, Opal." Troy sighed, waving his hand dismissively. "Let's just forget about last night. People drink, things get misunderstood. But we have real business to handle. The caterer needs the final check today, and I need the deposit for the honeymoon suite." I took a slow sip of my coffee. There is no check, and there is no deposit. Jenna slammed her hand on the counter. "Mom, you promised, you said you were paying for the wedding." "I promised to pay for my daughter's wedding," I replied calmly. "I did not promise to fund a real estate acquisition for a gold digger. The joint account is empty. I moved the money back to my personal account last night." Troy's face turned an ugly shade of red. "You can't do that. We signed contracts." "You signed contracts," I corrected him. "Your name is on the vendor agreements. You figure out how to pay them." Jenna glared at me, her face twisted in rage. "You are so selfish. This is exactly why Dad left the farm to you and not me. You control everything. Well, I'm going to be his wife. Half of this place is basically mine anyway." I looked at my daughter, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't a victim. She was willing to sell me out for a man with a nice smile. I rinsed my plate in the sink, dried my hands, and walked past them. I set my mug down and decided exactly how to handle my ungrateful guests. Later that morning, Jenna and Troy drove into town to try and do damage control with their vendors. The moment their car disappeared down the dirt road, I walked over to the equipment shed and found Arthur, my foreman. Arthur had worked on this farm since my husband was alive. He was a quiet, practical man who didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Arthur," I said, leaning against the wooden frame of the shed, "I need a favor. Go into town and buy new deadbolts for all the doors on the main house. Then change the code on the main gate." Arthur wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag and nodded. "Trouble." "Just doing some housekeeping," I replied. While Arthur handled the hardware, I went up to the guest bedroom. I didn't throw their things out the window or cut up Troy's expensive suits. I simply packed their clothes, toiletries, and electronics neatly into their suitcases. I hauled the bags downstairs, loaded them into the bed of my old farm truck, and drove out to the old hunting cabin on the far side of the property. The cabin had running water and electricity, but it was dusty, drafty, and lacked internet. It was a place for muddy boots, not silk ties. I placed their bags inside, locked the cabin door, and drove back. By 2 in the afternoon, the new locks were installed. The house was secure. At 4 o'clock, I was sitting on my porch peeling apples when their car pulled up. Troy marched up the steps, completely ignoring me, and shoved his key into the front door. It didn't turn. He rattled the knob, frowning. "The lock is stuck," he muttered, jiggling it harder. "It's not stuck," I said, tossing an apple peel into a bowl. "It's changed." Jenna marched up the steps, her face flushed with anger. "What are you talking about? Let us in." "Your things are in the hunting cabin," I replied, not looking up from my paring knife. "Here is the key." I tossed a single brass key onto the porch floor. Jenna stomped toward the wood, her face red, demanding access to her inheritance. Troy stared at the key on the wooden boards as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly looked up at me, the charming facade completely stripped away. His eyes were cold, calculating, and full of pure hostility. "You're making a huge mistake, Opal," he sneered, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't want to play games with me." "I'm not playing," I replied, setting the knife down. "This is my house. You don't live here." Jenna picked up the key, tears of frustration finally spilling over her cheeks. "Mom, you can't put us in the cabin. It smells like mildew, and there's no Wi-Fi. How is Troy supposed to work?" "He can work from a coffee shop in town," I suggested mildly. "You just don't get it," Jenna cried, stomping her foot like a toddler. "You don't need a 4-bedroom house. You're just one old woman, Troy, and I need the space to plan our future. You're just hoarding it out of spite." "I'm keeping it because I own it," I stated plainly. "Now get off my porch." They retreated to the cabin, but the peace didn't last. The next day, I drove to town to visit my bank again. I sat down with David in his quiet office and moved my primary operating funds from the local branch to a different institution entirely. I left just enough to cover the monthly utilities. If Troy thought he could sweet-talk a local teller or forge a document, he would find nothing but empty vaults. When I returned to the farm, I noticed the heavy padlock on the main garage had been tampered with. Scratches marred the metal. Troy had been trying to get inside. My late husband's vintage tools and my expensive riding mowers were in there. I didn't confront him. I simply drove my truck directly in front of the garage doors, blocking them completely, and took the battery out of the engine. If he wanted to get in, he would have to move 2 tons of steel with his bare hands. But Troy had a backup plan, one that involved my heavy equipment. By the 3rd day, the reality of their situation was setting in. Troy was agitated, pacing the yard, and aggressively talking on his phone. I watched from the kitchen window as he stormed toward the machine shed. He climbed into my newest tractor, a piece of equipment worth more than his life insurance policy. He actually thought he could just start it and use it. I had heard him bragging to Jenna earlier that he was going to clear a patch of woods near the creek to build a foundation for their new house. I walked out the back door, taking my time. He was frantically pushing buttons and turning the ignition switch, but the engine only clicked. "It won't start!" He yelled at me through the open cab door, completely lacking any self-awareness. "The battery is dead." I held up a small red plastic key, the master kill switch. "It's not dead. It's disabled." He climbed down, his fists clenched. "I need to clear that brush. We are building a house there." "You aren't building anything on my land," I said. "And if you touch my equipment again, you'll regret it." He stepped toward me, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Listen to me, you stubborn old bat. You are going to sign over that 5-acre parcel by the creek. Today. Or Jenna walks out of your life forever." I looked at him. "Are you threatening me with the garbage taking itself out?" His jaw dropped. He had no response to that. I turned my back on him and pulled out my phone. I dialed the number for Hank's towing in town. "Hank, it's Opal. I have an unauthorized vehicle parked on my access road, a black truck. Yes, tow it to the county impound lot. Thanks." Troy's face went white. "You wouldn't dare." 20 minutes later, Hank's heavy wrecker pulled up. Troy screamed and cursed, but Hank just hooked up the shiny truck and dragged it away down the dirt road. The sound of his pristine truck being dragged away was better than any apology. The towing of the truck broke whatever restraint Troy had left. He stormed into the hunting cabin and began throwing his clothes into a duffel bag. I stood by the pasture fence, watching the horses graze, entirely unbothered by the chaos erupting 50 yards away. Jenna ran out of the cabin, chasing after him. She was sobbing, grabbing his arm, begging him to stay. He shoved her off, yelling something I couldn't hear. A few minutes later, Jenna marched up the hill toward the main house. She looked terrible, exhausted, red-faced, and completely desperate. She found me by the fence. "Look what you did!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He's leaving! He's leaving because of you! He's leaving because I don't have a truck for him to drive or an account for him to drain." I corrected her, not raising my voice. "You have to fix this," Jenna demanded, grabbing the wooden rail of the fence. "Give him the deed to the creek parcel. Just sign it over." "If you do that, he'll stay," he promised. "Mom, please. I love him." I stared at my daughter. She was 30 years old, yet she was acting like a child, throwing a tantrum in a toy store. She didn't care about the farm. She didn't care about me. She only cared about keeping a man who viewed her as a transaction. I reached into the deep pocket of my chore coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I handed it to her. Jenna unfolded it eagerly, probably thinking it was a check or a contract. Instead, it was a printed copy of Troy's recent credit report, which I had found sitting open on the kitchen counter days ago. "He owes $80,000 in personal loans and credit cards," I said flatly. "He doesn't want to marry you, Jenna. He wants a bailout, and I will not let my grandfather's land be sold to pay for a con man." The realization hit my daughter, but it hit her fiancé even harder. "You violated his privacy," Jenna yelled, crumpling the paper and throwing it into the dirt. "He left his mail on my kitchen island," I replied calmly. I simply read what was in front of me. Down by the cabin, Troy had finished packing. He slung his heavy duffel bag over his shoulder and began the long walk down the driveway toward the main road. He didn't even look back at Jenna. He didn't call her name. He just walked away, eager to find a ride into town so he could retrieve his impounded truck and find his next mark. Jenna watched him go, her breath hitching in her chest. She took a step toward him, then stopped. Even she realized that chasing a man who was literally walking away from her in silence was a useless endeavor. She stood in the driveway for a long time, watching his figure get smaller and smaller until he disappeared around the bend. When she finally turned back to me, her shoulders were slumped. The arrogant, demanding daughter from yesterday was gone. replaced by a hollow shell of a woman who had just realized her entire future was a lie. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a silent plea. She expected me to run to her. She expected me to wrap my arms around her, stroke her hair, and tell her that everything was going to be okay. She expected me to invite her back into the big house, cook her favorite dinner, and let her cry on the expensive sofa while I paid off the remaining wedding cancellation fees. I didn't move. I kept my hands in my pockets and stood my ground. "Mom!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can we go inside? I'm so tired." I looked at her, feeling a deep, heavy sadness. But sadness is not an excuse to be a doormat. I wasn't going to fix a mess she helped create. Jenna stared at me, her jaw dropping in disbelief. "What do you mean I'm your daughter? Where am I supposed to go? You have the key to the hunting cabin." I told her, my voice unwavering. "You can stay there, but you will pay me $400 a month in rent, and you will get a job in town by the end of the week. If you don't like those rules, you can pack your bags and figure it out on your own." "You're kicking me out after my fiancé just left me." "I'm giving you a place to stay," I corrected. "But you lost the privilege of living in my home the moment you told me I was hoarding land and demanded I fund a man who called you ugly." Jenna opened her mouth to argue, but the fight had completely drained out of her. She looked at the big warm house, then down at the small dusty cabin. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the cabin, her head bowed. It took months for the dust to settle. Troy disappeared entirely, leaving Jenna with a mountain of unpaid vendor bills that she had to work 3 jobs to slowly pay off. I didn't give her a dime to help. She still lives in the cabin. We don't talk much, but last week she came up to the main house and quietly offered to help me paint the barn. It was a small step, but a necessary one. As for me, I sit on my porch every evening with a cup of tea, watching the sunset over my 400 acres. I am not a victim. I am a landowner, a mother, and a woman who knows her own worth. And I know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue or scream. It's to quietly change the locks, secure your assets, and let the trash take itself out.